Ethan Vance watched his wife, Sarah, smile thinly at a patron across the crowded gallery, the curated light catching the tension in her jaw. He was 1,000 miles away, still scrubbing surgery from his hands, when the whispers started, confirming his absence to every benefactor and socialite. Her eyes, when they finally found him later, were cold and empty, a silent judgment that stripped him bare. "You were never really here, were you?" she stated, the words a final surgical cut. Ethan Vance, a cardiac surgeon, arrives home late on a Tuesday in November after a demanding surgery. His wife of 12 years, Sarah Hayes, waits in their darkened living room, a nearly empty wine bottle beside her. She confronts him about missing her charity gallery opening, a pivotal event in her career. Sarah states that everyone seems to need him except his own wife, her voice sharp with resentment. Ethan attempts to justify his absence, citing the critical nature of his life-saving work. Sarah counters, questioning if she ever truly understood the man he would become, a man she perceives as emotionally distant, a machine. She expresses feeling like she is drowning in their marriage due to his increasing emotional absence. Ethan acknowledges the truth in her words, yet feels incapable of reconnecting with his past self. He finally asks if she is asking for a divorce, a question she confirms with a pained nod. Ethan begins to pack his belongings mechanically, his eyes lingering on a framed honeymoon photo. Sarah asks a final, poignant question about her own adequacy within their relationship. Ethan offers a desolate response, admitting she was always too good for him. He leaves their home, marking the end of their 12-year marriage and shared life. 6 months pass in a blur of professional obligation and personal isolation within a new, sterile apartment. He signs the divorce papers without review, granting Sarah everything. An unknown number calls, revealing Sarah's panicked voice, informing him of her father, Walter's sudden collapse. The glow of the living room lamp barely cut through the November gloom when Ethan Vance finally pulled his sedan into the driveway. It was past 11, a Tuesday, the lingering smell of antiseptic clinging to his scrubs even after a thorough shower at the hospital. Another emergency bypass, another life held by threads. He walked through the front door, the click of the lock unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Sarah Hayes sat on the sofa, silhouetted against the dark window. A wine glass rested on the end table, beside a bottle of Pinot Noir, nearly empty. He could make out the faint, sharp line of her shoulders. 12 years of marriage, and still, her stillness could make him hold his breath. "You missed it," she said, her voice flat, not a question. He dropped his briefcase by the coat rack. "Another one went south, Sarah. A triple bypass. Not much choice." "The gallery opening," she clarified, her voice gaining a brittle edge. "My gallery opening, the biggest night of my career. The one I've been talking about for 6 months." He moved to stand in front of her, feeling the distance between them. "I know, I'm sorry, I really am." He wanted to reach for her, but his hands felt heavy, useless. "Everyone needs you," Sarah stated, her eyes finally meeting his, "except your wife." Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air, precise and cold. "I save lives, Sarah," he said, the old defense rising, worn smooth from years of use. "You knew what you were getting into." "Did I really know I was marrying a man?" she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Who would gradually turn into a machine, who would vanish piece by piece until there was nothing left but a scalpel and a schedule." She looked around the room, then back at him. "I feel like I'm drowning, Ethan, and you're on the shore watching the tide come in." He felt the truth of it, a dull ache behind his ribs. He saw the erosion she spoke of, recognized the man she described. The old Ethan, the one who danced with her in the kitchen and remembered her favorite coffee shop order, was a ghost. He tried to summon him, to find the words to fight, but the well was dry. "You're saying you want a divorce?" he asked, the words hanging heavy in the silent room. He watched her flinch, a slight tremor. Then slowly she nodded, a small, definitive movement. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. He walked to the bedroom, the movements of his hands mechanical as he pulled a worn duffel bag from the closet. Shirts, a toothbrush, a book he hadn't opened in months. His eyes caught on a small, framed photo on the nightstand. Their honeymoon in Greece, sun-drenched and smiling, a lifetime ago. He picked it up, feeling the smooth glass. Sarah stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. Was I ever enough for you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at the picture, then back at her. Her face was pale in the dim light. You were always too good for me, he replied. The words tasted like ash. He didn't wait for a response, didn't look back again. He walked out, leaving behind 12 years, a house full of ghosts, and the last flicker of whatever they had once been. The front door closed with a soft thud, a final punctuation. 6 months dissolved into a blur of long shifts in the sterile quiet of his new apartment downtown. He worked, he ate alone, he slept. The apartment was furnished in functional grays and whites, devoid of personal history. When the divorce papers arrived, a thick envelope from her lawyer, he signed them without reading, letting Sarah have everything. He just wanted it done. The phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He answered, his voice flat. Vance. A choked sob came through the line. Ethan? It was Sarah. Her voice was panicked, ragged. It's Dad, she gasped. Walter collapsed. Ethan's heart rate spikes, a rare surge of strong emotion after months of numbness. Walter Hayes, Sarah's father, is a paternal figure to Ethan. He immediately drives to Boston Memorial Hospital, arriving just as the ambulance pulls in. Ethan reflexively uses Walter's old name, Robert Green, while briefing Dr. Miller, then corrects himself. He introduces himself as Walter's ex-son-in-law and a cardiothoracic surgeon, taking immediate command. Walter is conscious but pale, an oxygen mask covering his face. He reassures Ethan with a familiar nickname. Ethan quickly orders an EKG, cardiac enzymes, and a chest x-ray, also paging Dr. Olson, a top cardiologist. The following 30 minutes are a frantic rush as Walter's condition rapidly worsens. Dr. Olson confirms a severe diagnosis, a massive myocardial infarction actively damaging Walter's heart. They swiftly transport Walter to the cath lab for an urgent medical procedure. Ethan, consumed by familiar, intense focus, takes charge of the medical team. He expertly performs the angioplasty, clearing the arterial blockages with practiced precision. The procedure is successful, and Walter's condition stabilizes, though he remains critical. Sarah arrives, looking disheveled and tearful, grasping Ethan's arm in a moment of profound gratitude. She whispers her thanks to Ethan, her voice heavy with emotion. He informs her of Walter's stable condition, emphasizing the need for recovery time, and guides her to his room. The receiver felt cold against Ethan's ear. Walter collapsed. Sarah's voice, usually so composed, was frayed, ripped. For 6 months, his chest had felt like a dead space, a hollow cavity where a heart once beat. Now, a sharp, sudden spike of adrenaline, a frantic drum against his ribs. Walter Hayes. Not just Sarah's father, but the closest thing Ethan had to his own since his dad passed. The man who taught him how to bait a hook, how to change a tire, how to be decent. Which hospital? Ethan asked, his voice tighter than he expected. Boston Memorial. They're on their way now. He hung up, the quiet hum of the dial tone a stark contrast to the urgency in his blood. He didn't bother changing out of his day clothes. Keys in hand, he was out the door in under a minute, the sterile apartment left behind in his haste. The drive was a blur of highway lights and quick lane changes. He pulled into the emergency bay just as an ambulance, sirens now muted, backed into a slot. He was out of his car before the EMTs had fully opened the back doors. What do we have? He barked, falling into the familiar cadence of a surgeon assessing a trauma. Male, 64, suspected MI, one of the EMTs rattled off. Robert Green. Ethan's brow furrowed. It's Walter Hayes, he corrected automatically, then remembered. Robert Green was Walter's old stage name from his short-lived acting career, a detail almost no one remembered. My ex-father-in-law. I'm Dr. Vance, cardiothoracic surgery. Dr. Miller, I presume, he said, turning to the attending physician who was already at the stretcher. He took charge without question, the instinct overriding any personal awkwardness. Walter lay on the stretcher, pale as the hospital sheets, an oxygen mask obscuring most of his face. His eyes, though, were open, a little foggy, but recognizing. It's Jack. Ethan, he rasped, his voice weak. Jack was another old nickname from his early days dating Sarah, before Walter had fully accepted him. It was a comfort, a thread of normalcy in the chaos. "We got you, Walter," Ethan said, his hand briefly touching Walter's shoulder. "Let's get him in. EKG, cardiac enzymes, chest x-ray. Page Dr. Olson, stat. Tell her it's an urgent consult. Suspected massive MI." The next 30 minutes were a brutal ballet of controlled urgency. Monitors beeped, nurses moved with practiced speed, residents called out vitals. Walter's condition, stable on arrival, began to slip. His blood pressure dipped, his breathing grew shallow. The EKG confirmed the worst, a severe ST elevation, the classic sign of a heart attack. Dr. Olson, a compact woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, arrived, reviewing the readings. "Massive myocardial infarction," she stated, her voice calm despite the gravity. "Actively damaging the heart. We need to get him to the cath lab now." No one questioned Ethan's presence. He was a surgeon, a good one, and this was his family. He scrubbed in, the scent of surgical soap a comfort, the familiar routine a steadying force. In the cath lab, surrounded by monitors and the hushed hum of machinery, he felt a singular, intense focus. This was where he belonged, where he could fix things. He threaded the catheter, guided by the fluoroscope, his hands steady, precise. He saw the blockages, stark white shadows against the dark, and worked to clear them, a delicate dance of wires and balloons. The angioplasty was successful. He watched the blood flow return, a bright rush of red on the screen. Walter's vital signs stabilized, the frantic beeping of the monitors slowing to a steady rhythm. He was still critical, but he was alive. When Ethan emerged from the cath lab, scrubbing out, Sarah was there, leaning against the wall, her face blotchy from tears, hair disheveled. She looked exhausted, vulnerable. She saw him, and a wave of relief washed over her features. She pushed herself off the wall, walked to him, and gripped his arm, her fingers tight against his sleeve. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes searching his. "He's stable," Ethan said, his voice flat, professional, masking the tremor he felt inside. "We got the blockages cleared. He's going to need time to recover, and he's still critical, but the immediate danger has passed." He gently pulled his arm free, then gestured down the hallway. "They're moving him to recovery. Come on." He led her towards the double doors, leaving the sterile intensity of the cath lab behind. Ethan regularly checks on Walter, encountering Sarah frequently under strained circumstances. Walter, during his recovery, expresses deep gratitude to Ethan, affirming his continued paternal affection. A few weeks later, Walter is discharged, and Ethan visits him at home. He discovers it's Sarah with an architect named Kyle Jensen, who is helping her hang newborn artwork. Kyle's casual familiarity with both Sarah and Walter instills a sense of unease in Ethan. Later, Ethan observes Kyle and Sarah at a coffee shop, noticing a tender intimacy in Kyle's touch. He subtly questions Sarah's art assistant Connie about Kyle, who speaks highly of his support for Sarah pre-divorce. A chilling realization dawns on Ethan, prompting him to reevaluate the timeline of his divorce. He recalls Sarah's increasing emotional distance and the definitive tone in her voice on the night of their separation. Ethan leverages his professional network, discreetly requesting patient dating records from Dr. Peterson, focusing on the period before his divorce. He uncovers a patient record for Kyle Jensen, with an initial visit dated 15 months prior to his divorce. He notes an unusual pattern of Kyle's visits to the same clinic Sarah occasionally used for minor health concerns. The truth dawns on him. The affair began long before their divorce was ever mentioned. His initial pain from the separation transforms into a potent, sickening rage. The hospital routine settled, a rhythm Ethan knew well. He made it a point to check on Walter daily, a quick stop between rounds. Sarah was often there, perched by her father's bedside, her face still drawn but slowly regaining its color. Their interactions were stiff, polite nods, murmured updates, a strained civility that felt paper-thin. He was a doctor, she was a daughter. The past was locked away in a separate room. "You saved me, son," Walter rasped one afternoon, his voice stronger, eyes clearer. "Still think of you that way, you know, like my own." Ethan just nodded, a tight knot in his throat. He understood the sentiment. Walter had been a father when Ethan needed one most. A few weeks later, Walter was discharged, sent home with strict instructions and a full recovery plan. Ethan dropped by his house a few days after, bringing a bag of fresh fruit Walter preferred. He pushed open the screen door, hearing voices inside. Sarah was in the living room, standing on a step stool, directing a man with short, tidy hair. He was holding up a large framed abstract painting. "A little to the left, Kyle. Perfect." The man, Kyle Jensen, smiled easily. "Just making sure your artistic vision is perfectly aligned, Sarah." He adjusted the canvas. Walter sat in his armchair, watching, a faint smile on his face. "Ethan," Sarah said, turning, her expression momentarily surprised, then settling into her familiar guarded politeness. "Didn't expect you." "Just dropped off some fruit for Walter," Ethan replied, handing the bag over. He nodded at Kyle. "Kyle Jensen," Sarah introduced, "an architect. He's been helping me with some new gallery installations and, well, general heavy lifting here." Kyle extended a hand, firm grip. "Heard a lot about you, to advance it for Walter and Sarah speak highly." His tone was too casual, too familiar. The way he looked at Sarah, a quick, almost imperceptible glance, made something tighten in Ethan's stomach. Later that week, Ethan was grabbing a coffee near the hospital. He saw them through the window of The Daily Grind, a small cafe known for its artisanal brews. Sarah and Kyle sat opposite each other, heads close. Kyle's hand rested on Sarah's, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. It was a gesture of quiet intimacy, a tenderness Ethan hadn't seen directed at Sarah in years, certainly not from him. A cold coil began to form in his gut. He bumped into Connie, Sarah's art assistant, a few days later in the hospital cafeteria. She was there visiting a friend. "How's the gallery been?" Etienne asked, making small talk. "Oh, busy, especially with Kyle around. He's been a godsend to Sarah, really. So supportive." Connie stirred her coffee. "He helped her so much through everything. Even before you two, the divorce." The words hung in the air. "Even before you two, the divorce." A cold dread began to settle in Ethan's chest, heavy and precise. He excused himself, the rest of his coffee musting like ash. He replayed the last year, the timeline of their divorce. Sarah's increasing distance, his own preoccupation. Her insistence that night, the absolute finality in her voice. Did I really know I was marrying a man who would gradually turn into a machine? Was that just a convenient narrative? Ethan had a network, threads woven through the medical community. He called Dr. Peterson, a former colleague from a different department, now specializing in patient intake and records management across several local clinics, including one Sarah occasionally visited for minor complaints. "Hey Mark, casual favor, just need to check some dating records. Nothing major, just cross-referencing for a research project. Private data, of course. For patient Kyle Jensen. Specifically, any visits before, say, about a year and a half ago, and any patterns with specific clinics." Mark, ever the professional, called back a few hours later. "Found him, Ethan. Kyle Jensen, architect, initial visit. Let's see, 15 months before your divorce was finalized, and an interesting frequency of visits to the Artisan Health Clinic. That's the one your ex-wife sometimes used, isn't it?" The air left Ethan's lungs in a slow, ragged breath. 15 months. The divorce papers had been signed 6 months ago. The conversation, the finality of it, had been another 6 months before that. 15 months meant it had begun long before the word divorce had ever been uttered. It meant he wasn't just a machine. He was a fool. The initial pain of their separation, the quiet resignation, now transmuted into something else entirely. A burning, sickening rage that spread through his veins, cold and precise, like a surgical instrument. Ethan confirms Kyle Jensen is the man involved with Sarah. He meticulously reviews Kyle's patient file, not for medical concerns, but for hidden answers. Kyle's medical history reveals a congenital heart defect, surgically repaired in childhood, but with a persistent, subtle arrhythmia. Dr. Patel had diligently documented this condition, marking it for ongoing monitoring. Ethan investigates Kyle's professional background, noting his success as a prominent architect in Boston. He confronts Sarah at her gallery, not directly about Kyle, but about the true origins of their divorce. He asks, his voice low and barely contained, "You knew, didn't you? about us ending, long before that night. Sarah avoids his gaze, visibly flustered, denying knowledge of his accusation. Ethan presses her, questioning the suddenness of her decision to end their marriage. She defensively retorts that their separation was the result of years of cumulative issues. He subtly introduces Kyle's name, observing her face blanch, commenting on Kyle's apparent well-being. Sarah snaps back, defending Kyle and accusing Ethan of being an inferior man, which confirms Ethan's suspicions. Ethan now understands the affair was real and predated their divorce. A cold, precise plan for professional revenge begins to solidify in Ethan's mind. He starts researching the subtle, ethical boundaries within his medical profession. He initiates a subtle manipulation of Kyle's medical record, deleting crucial heart defect information from readily accessible sections, ensuring it is no longer prominently flagged. The name Kyle Jensen settled in Ethan's mind, a jagged piece of glass. He went back to Peterson, feigning an interest in a complex cardiovascular case. That Jensen file, he murmured, his voice even. Any unusual cardiac history? Just curious. He was flagged for a different reason, if I recall. Peterson, oblivious, pulled up the full file. Ethan scanned it, not for patient data, but for a different kind of truth. Kyle's medical history was unremarkable until he hit a specific section, a congenital heart defect, repaired in early childhood, but with a note from Dr. Patel documenting a lingering subtle arrhythmia. Intermittent, mild, but warrants monitoring, and the note read, dated years ago. It was a detail most doctors might overlook in a healthy adult, but to Ethan, it was a precise weakness, a vulnerability. He spent the next few days researching Kyle Jensen more thoroughly. A quick online search confirmed what Connie had said. Kyle was a successful architect, known for modern designs, well-connected in the Boston art scene. His firm had even designed a wing for a new museum downtown. The kind of man who'd fit into Sarah's world, a world Ethan had increasingly felt alienated from. He found Sarah at her gallery the following Tuesday, arranging a new display. The space was bright, sterile, filled with expensive silence. He walked in, the bell above the door jingling faintly. "Ethan," she said without turning, recognizing his footsteps. "Walter's fine, if that's why you were here." "Not just Walter," he replied, his voice low, deliberately calm. He stopped a few feet behind her. "Us, the divorce." She finally turned, her hands still hovering over a ceramic sculpture. "What about it?" Her eyes held a flicker of impatience. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked, letting the words hang in the air. "About us ending long before that night in the living room when you said you were drowning. That wasn't the first time you thought about it." His voice was soft, but underneath, a controlled tremor of accusation. She looked away, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "Ethan, what are you talking about? It was a long time coming, you know that." "The day you chose to end our marriage," he pressed, taking a step closer. "It wasn't a sudden thing, was it? A burst of clarity?" She snapped her head up, her eyes flashing. "It was the culmination of years, Ethan. Years of you being absent, of being married to your work, not to me." Her voice rose, sharper now. He let her words hang, letting the anger settle back into her. Then very casually, he dropped it. "Kyle seems to be doing well. Architect. Good for you finding someone who understands your world." Her face went pale, the color draining quickly. The anger in her eyes shifted to something like fear, or perhaps guilt. "He's a good man, Ethan," she retorted, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with conviction. "Unlike you." The statement was a confirmation, a cold, hard fact settling into place. The affair was real. It predated their divorce. It wasn't just his absence that pushed her away. It was Kyle pulling her in. The realization didn't bring sadness, only a chilling clarity. The grief had been for a marriage that died of neglect. This was something darker. This was betrayal. A plan, cold and precise, began to form in Ethan's mind. Not emotional revenge. That was messy and unsatisfying. This would be professional, surgical. He spent the next few nights in his study, poring over medical journals, ethical guidelines, and legal precedents. He researched the subtle ethical boundaries of his profession, the gray areas where discretion could shift fate. How much could he influence without overtly crossing a line? His fingers moved with purpose over his keyboard, accessing the vast interconnected network of the hospital's patient files. He located Kyle Jensen's records, the flag for the subtle arrhythmia, the note from Dr. Patel, critical information for any medical professional assessing Kyle's overall health. With a few precise keystrokes, he began to manipulate, not deleting outright, that was too obvious, too illegal, but subtly recategorizing, shifting prominence. He moved the crucial details of the congenital defect and the lingering arrhythmia into subsections, deep within the archive, ensuring they weren't prominently flagged for future medical staff. Out of sight, out of mind, until it truly mattered. Ethan systematically removes the prominent flag from Kyle's digital medical chart regarding his congenital heart issue. He ensures the original crucial data is deeply embedded, retrievable only with specific keywords, not standard queries. He adopts a new routine of regularly visiting Walter, meticulously observing the developing relationship between Sarah and Kyle. Walter expresses his concerns about Kyle's health to Ethan, mentioning heart flutters he's observed. Walter admits, "He worries me, Ethan," explaining Kyle sometimes experiences shortness of breath. Ethan feigns genuine concern, subtly recommending Kyle seek a comprehensive cardiac workup from a new physician, diverting him from Dr. Patel. He learns that Kyle is actively pressuring Sarah to move in with him. Sarah confides in Walter about her conflicted feelings, caught between the desire for a fresh start and lingering guilt. Ethan witnesses her emotional distress, but his burning resentment for her betrayal overrides any potential empathy. He discovers Kyle is under immense pressure due to a significant project deadline, working extended hours. Ethan subtly suggests to Sarah that Kyle should undergo a full medical checkup for his stress-related symptoms. Sarah, genuinely worried for Kyle's well-being, urges him to consult a doctor. Kyle eventually agrees to a checkup, ending up with a new general practitioner Ethan had subtly influenced. The GP, lacking the crucial flagged information, conducts a routine medical examination. The GP fails to detect the subtle arrhythmia and declares Kyle in good health, attributing his symptoms to stress. The digital archive of Boston Memorial Hospital hummed with data. Ethan, late at night, hunched over his office computer, finalized the meticulous burial of Kyle Jensen's congenital heart defect. The flag, a bright yellow indicator signaling a need for vigilance, was gone. The original documentation from Dr. Patel remained untouched, deep within the system, requiring a specific, obscure search query to unearth. No routine checkup, no standard medical history poll would bring it to the surface. It was a ghost in the machine, present but unseen. His new routine became visits to Walter's house, ostensibly to check on his recovery. In reality, it was a surveillance post. He watched Sarah and Kyle together, the way Kyle would brush a stray hair from Sarah's face, the easy laughter that flowed between them. It was a life Ethan had once shared, now polished and offered to another. One afternoon, while Sarah was out, Walter pulled Ethan aside. "Kyle worries me, Ethan," he confided, his voice low. "He gets these heart flutters, he calls them. And sometimes he's short of breath. He brushes it off as stress from his big project. But it's not right." Ethan feigned a look of concern. That's not good, Walter. He's still young, but that's a symptom you shouldn't ignore." He paused as if considering. Maybe he should get a full cardiac workup. A new set of eyes, perhaps. Someone who isn't already familiar with his history, so they can be objective. No offense to Dr. Patel, of course, but sometimes a fresh perspective is best. The suggestion was subtle, planted with precision. Walter nodded, worried. He also learned that Kyle was pushing Sarah to move in with him. Sarah seemed conflicted, a new layer of worry etched onto her face. Walter mentioned it almost apologetically. "She's torn, Ethan, says she loves him, but feels like she's moving too fast. And there's a part of her, I think, that still feels guilty." Ethan saw her pain, the quiet struggle. But the burning resentment for the betrayal, for the calculated deception, outweighed any flicker of empathy. He learned through Sarah's art assistant, Connie, that Kyle was under immense pressure. A massive architectural project, tight deadlines, late nights at the office. "He's practically living on caffeine and stress," Connie had remarked, shaking her head. A few days later, Ethan found Sarah at Walter's house. "How's Kyle doing with that project?" he asked, casual as ever. Sarah sighed. "Stressed, always working. Says he's fine, but he looks worn out." "Those heart flutters your dad mentioned, in the shortness of breath," Ethan mused. "Could be stress-related, sure. But at his age, with that kind of pressure, it's worth getting checked out. A full workup, just to rule things out, for peace of mind." He made it sound like a friendly, professional suggestion, a doctor looking out for a friend's well-being. Sarah, clearly worried, took the bait. "I've told him the same thing. He just shrugs it off." "Keep pushing him," Ethan advised, "for your sake if not his. No point in him collapsing from overwork." The words were laced with a cruel irony. Sarah did push. Kyle, exhausted and wanting to appease her, finally agreed to a checkup. And because Ethan had subtly recommended a new GP to Walter, and Walter had then recommended him to Sarah, who then mentioned him to Kyle, the chain was complete. Kyle ended up with Dr. Miller, a conscientious but overworked general practitioner who relied heavily on digital flags and quick chart reviews. Dr. Miller, seeing no red flags in Kyle's streamlined digital chart, performed a standard physical. No unusual history jumped out. He listened to his heart, noted a slightly elevated blood pressure consistent with stress, but missed the subtle, intermittent arrhythmia. He attributed Kyle's flutters and shortness of breath to the intense demands of his architectural project. "Clean bill of health, Mr. Jensen," he had likely said, patting him on the shoulder. "Just try to de-stress. Maybe take a vacation after this project wraps up. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold." Months pass as Kyle and Sarah move in together. Ethan continues to monitor Kyle through subtle inquiries and observations of their public appearances. Kyle's work pressures intensify, leading to escalating stress levels. One evening, Ethan receives a call from Nurse Kelly at Boston Memorial ER, informing him of Kyle Jensen's suspected MI and his request for Ethan. Ethan's heart pounds as his plan culminates, experiencing a chilling sense of reality. He rushes to the ER, feigning surprise and exhibiting professional concern. Kyle is in critical condition, having suffered a massive heart attack, far more severe than Walter's. Miller explains the alarming situation, noting an unusual pattern of severe, widespread heart damage. Ethan accesses Kyle's chart, confirming the crucial information about his congenital defect is deeply buried. He mentally notes the previous clean bill of health, a direct outcome of his deliberate manipulation. Ethan immediately declares the need to transport Kyle to the cath lab, taking authoritative command of the situation. Sarah arrives, distraught, and upon seeing Ethan, pleads with him, "Please, Ethan, save him." Ethan prepares for surgery, enveloped by a chilling professional calm. During the operation, he expertly addresses the immediate blockages. However, he deliberately forgoes a critical, high-risk yet potentially life-altering surgical intervention that could significantly improve Kyle's long-term prognosis, given his underlying condition. He internally rationalizes this omission as standard procedure for the acute crisis, consciously avoiding the more complex, higher-risk choice that could secure Kyle's future. Months turned into a quiet blur. Kyle and Sarah moved into a renovated brownstone on Beacon Hill, a detail Ethan learned from Walter. He saw them occasionally at gallery openings or charity events, Sarah's hand often linked with Kyle's. Kyle looked thinner, a little more worn, the lines around his eyes deeper. The architectural project, Ethan gathered from overheard conversations and casual inquiries, was reaching a fever pitch. Stress, real stress, a potent accelerant for an already compromised heart. The call came just past midnight, his private line ringing urgently. Nurse Kelly from Boston Memorial ER. Her voice, usually calm, was clipped with urgency. "Javance, we have a Kyle Jensen, suspected MI. Massive. He's asking for you specifically." Ethan's heart, usually a steady drum, gave a hard thump against his ribs. The plan. It had come to fruition. A cold, precise chill snaked through him, not of fear but of stark reality. He felt a detached sense of dread, like watching a perfectly executed experiment reach its inevitable, calculated conclusion. He grabbed his jacket, keys, and drove. He arrived at the ER, striding in with the practiced urgency of a cardiac surgeon, shedding any personal connection, becoming pure function. He feigned surprise when he saw Kyle on the gurney, his face ashen, gasping for air, the monitor beeping a frantic rhythm. "Kyle," Ethan said, his voice grave, professional concern etched onto his face. He leaned over. "What happened?" Dr. Miller, the same GP who'd given Kyle a clean bill of health, stood by, looking flustered. "Dr. Vance, thank God you're here. Massive heart attack. Significantly worse than Walter Hayes's. He collapsed at his office. We're seeing an unusual pattern. Severe, widespread damage." Ethan accessed Kyle's chart on the portable monitor. His eyes quickly scanned, confirming the crucial information about the congenital defect was still buried, deep in the archives unflagged. He noted the clean bill of health from Miller's previous assessment, a direct result of his own careful manipulation. A pang, not of guilt, but of grim satisfaction. "We need to get him to the cath lab immediately," Ethan declared, his voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. He took command, his authority absolute. Just as they were wheeling Kyle away, Sarah burst into the ER, her eyes wide with terror. She saw Kyle, then her gaze landed on Ethan. Tears streamed down her face. "Please, Ethan," she sobbed, rushing to him, gripping his arm. "Please save him." He looked into her desperate eyes, her face a mask of raw pain, the kind of pain he remembered seeing in the mirror after their divorce. He nodded, a solemn professional nod. "We're doing everything we can, Sarah." In the operating room, the lights were harsh, the air cool. Ethan scrubbed in, a chilling calm descending upon him. This was his domain. He was a surgeon, the best. His hands were steady, precise, as he guided the catheters, navigating the intricate landscape of Kyle's damaged heart. He addressed the acute blockages, cleared the immediate threats, restored the crucial blood flow. He was brilliant, efficient, saving the life that was actively slipping away. But as he worked, a different choice presented itself. Given Kyle's underlying congenital defect and now this massive MI, there was a more aggressive, higher-risk intervention, a complex bypass graft, or a specific type of stent placement that would significantly improve Kyle's long-term outcome, fortifying his weakened heart against future events. It was a choice that would require more time, carry a higher immediate risk of complication, but offer a far better prognosis. Ethan, however, chose the standard, safer, more immediate solution. He justified it internally. This was an acute crisis. The priority was to stabilize, not to take unnecessary risks with an already compromised patient. The long-term, more complex solution, while potentially beneficial, was not standard procedure for this specific acute presentation. He sealed the immediate wounds, ensuring Kyle would live. But he left the deeper vulnerability, the true extent of the congenital weakness, unaddressed in the way he could have, the way that would truly save Kyle's future. The surgery concludes. Kyle is stable, but remains severely compromised. Ethan informs Sarah and Walter that Kyle's heart sustained significant damage, leading to severe lifelong limitations. Sarah collapses in grief, ironically finding solace by clinging to Ethan. Ethan experiences a hollow sense of victory, tainted by a growing unease. Weeks give way to months of Kyle's arduous recovery, characterized by pain, frustration, and increased dependence. Kyle's demanding career ends abruptly, as he can no longer tolerate the associated stress. Sarah dedicates herself entirely to Kyle's care, her artistic pursuits pushed aside, her life profoundly altered. Ethan continues his work, but the shadow of his deliberate actions relentlessly follows him. He begins to suffer from nightmares, plagued by fragmented visions of Kyle's damaged heart and Sarah's tear-streaked face. Dr. Peterson, a colleague, subtly questions some of Ethan's surgical decisions regarding Kyle. Peterson comments on the conservative nature of the surgery, given Kyle's history, but quickly drops the subject when Ethan deflects. An anonymous tip is lodged with the medical board, raising questions about Kyle Jensen's care, particularly the failure to detect his congenital defect earlier. The medical board initiates an investigation into Kyle's comprehensive medical history and treatment. Ethan receives official notification that his records pertaining to Kyle Jensen are under stringent review. He meticulously scrutinizes his past actions, constructing rationalizations and a meticulous paper trail to conceal his deliberate manipulation. The operating room lights dimmed, the instruments cleaned, the sterile covers pulled back. Kyle Jensen was stable. He was alive. But the words Ethan delivered to Sarah and Walter in the small, fluorescent-lit waiting room were brutally honest. His heart sustained significant damage. Massive. He'll have severe limitations. No more high-stress work. Probably no more strenuous activity. It's a miracle he made it through, but his life will be very different now. Sarah crumpled, a guttural sound torn from her throat. She fell against Ethan, clinging to his surgical scrubs, her body shaking with raw grief. He held her stiffly, feeling the hollow victory churn inside him, mingled with a faint, unsettling unease. Walter, beside them, simply looked old, his face etched with sorrow. Weeks bled into months. Kyle's recovery was arduous. Physical therapy, medication, endless appointments. Ethan kept tabs, subtly. Kyle's once vibrant career as an architect was over. The stress, the long hours, the relentless deadlines, all impossible now. Sarah, in turn, dedicated herself to his care. Her gallery, her art, once the center of her ambition, receded into the background. Her life, too, had been drastically altered. She was bound to him, a nurse, a caregiver, a shadow of her former self. The picture of their happy life together, the one Kyle had been building, had shattered. Ethan continued his work. He performed complex surgeries, saved lives, lectured, but the shadow of his actions followed him. The faces of his patients sometimes blurred into Kyle's ashen form or Sarah's tear-streaked face. He started to have nightmares, fragmented images of a heart, scarred and weak, struggling against the tide in Sarah's accusing eyes. Sleep offered little escape. One afternoon in the doctor's lounge, Dr. Peterson, who had helped Ethan retrieve Kyle's initial medical records, approached him casually. "That Jensen case, Ethan, we were talking about it, just seems conservative, your approach. Given his history, the congenital defect. I mean, you're the best. I would have thought you'd go for the full repair, the long-term solution." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Acute crisis, Mark. The priority was stabilization. Minimize risk. Sometimes the most aggressive isn't the best, not when the patient is already on the brink." He shrugged, turning back to his coffee. Peterson, sensing the deflection, dropped it, but his gaze lingered a moment too long. Then the first official tremor, an anonymous tip to the medical board. The focus, Kyle Jensen's care, specifically the lack of early detection of his congenital defect in the subsequent conservative treatment during his MI. The board, meticulous and thorough, launched an investigation into Kyle's entire medical history and treatment. A certified letter arrived at Ethan's office. His records for Kyle Jensen, from the initial pre-op consultations to the surgical reports, were officially under review. He spent hours in his study, going over every detail, every notation, every decision. He meticulously reviewed his own actions, finding ways to rationalize his choices, creating a paper trail to obscure his manipulation. The notes on why he chose the standard procedure over the high-risk long-term one. The justifications for not performing a full cardiac workup when Kyle presented with symptoms earlier, before the MI. It was all plausible, all defensible, if you didn't know the subtle, almost invisible adjustments he had made to the very foundation of Kyle's medical history. He was a surgeon, after all. He knew how to cut, and he knew how to cover his tracks. The medical board investigation intensifies, meticulously scrutinizing Ethan's professional actions. He is rigorously questioned about the inexplicably missing flag on Kyle's digital chart and his specific surgical choices. Ethan steadfastly maintains his innocence, asserting his professional judgment, adherence to standard protocols, and the inherent chaos of an emergency situation. Walter Hayes, now physically stronger, discerns Ethan's internal turmoil and the strained dynamic between Ethan and Sarah. He confronts Ethan privately, expressing concern over his apparent change. Ethan, overwhelmed, confesses to Walter about Sarah's affair, the deliberate alteration of Kyle's medical records, and the subtle manipulation during surgery. Walter is devastated by his daughter's betrayal and the calculated revenge exacted by the man he still considers a son. Walter expresses his profound sorrow, lamenting that Ethan used his medical gift to inflict harm, stating it contradicts Ethan's true character. Ethan also confesses to his sister, Megan Vance, who, despite her horror, offers him unwavering support. As the medical board hearing draws near, Ethan fully comprehends that the truth of his actions is bound to emerge. He prepares himself for the inevitable professional downfall, acknowledging the likely end of his career. Sarah, exhausted and burdened by Kyle's demanding care, stumbles upon a subtle discrepancy in Kyle's archived medical files while searching for unrelated information. A cold dread overtakes her as she begins to connect Ethan's past peculiar behavior, his probing questions, and the precise timeline of events. She confronts Ethan, her eyes reflecting a mixture of horror and dawning, gut-wrenching understanding, asking, "You did this, didn't you?" The medical board investigation tightened its grip. Ethan was called in repeatedly, his actions dissected, his every notation on Kyle's chart scrutinized. He sat in sterile conference rooms, facing a panel of stern-faced colleagues. Questions about the missing flag on Kyle's digital chart, about the congenital defect that hadn't been prominently highlighted, about his conservative surgical choices. He maintained his innocence, his voice steady, his explanations plausible. Best judgment, given the acute state of crisis, standard protocols for stabilization. The ER was chaotic, a massive MI. My focus was saving his life. He was a master of medical jargon, weaving a narrative of professional competence that obscured the deliberate omissions. But the pressure was relentless. The shadow was growing darker. Walter Hayes, recovering slowly, saw the change in Ethan. He noticed the tightness around Ethan's mouth, the guarded look in his eyes whenever Kyle or Sarah was mentioned. One evening, after Sarah had gone home to relieve the nurse, Walter called Ethan into his study. "What's going on, son?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "You've changed. This whole thing with Kyle, it's eating at you." The words, spoken by the man he respected more than almost anyone, broke through Ethan's carefully constructed defenses. He sat down, the weight of it all suddenly crushing. He confessed. The affair, the buried records, the subtle surgical manipulation. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. Walter listened, his face slowly draining of color. When Ethan finished, the room was silent, save for the ticking grandfather clock. Walter's voice, when he finally spoke, was filled with a profound sorrow. "You used your gift to hurt a man, Ethan. That's not who you are. That's not the boy I raised." The judgment was quiet, devastating. It was worse than any medical board, any legal proceeding. Ethan also confessed to his sister, Megan. She listened, horrified, her hands pressed to her mouth. "Ethan, what have you done?" she whispered, tears in her eyes. But then, true to their bond, she hugged him. "It's going to be okay. We'll figure this out. I'm here." Her loyalty was a small, fragile comfort. The medical board hearing loomed. Ethan knew. The truth in some form would eventually surface. He had bought time, but not permanent absolution. He started to prepare himself for the inevitable fallout, the public disgrace. His career, the one thing he had built his life around, was likely over. The thought was a cold, empty cavern. Meanwhile, Sarah was living a different kind of hell. Exhausted, burdened by Kyle's constant care, his frustration, his dependence. One night, while looking through Kyle's old files for his blood type for a new prescription, she stumbled. Not on the buried record itself, but on a subtle discrepancy. A note, old and faded, from a pediatric cardiologist, mentioning a congenital septal defect, surgically corrected, follow-up recommended for residual arrhythmia. It was a detail that should have been prominent, easily accessible. But in Kyle's streamlined current digital chart, it was gone, buried. A cold dread washed over her. She remembered Ethan's strange behavior, his pointed questions about Kyle's health, long before the heart attack, the way he had pushed her to get Kyle checked out, the odd silence from Dr. Miller about Kyle's history, the timeline replaying in her mind, click by click. She drove to Ethan's sterile downtown apartment, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm, a counterpoint to the quiet rage building inside her. She didn't bother to knock, simply let herself in with the spare key she still had. Ethan was sitting in his living room, staring out at the city lights. He turned, his face etched with a familiar weariness. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hands shaking, the old, faded medical note clutched in her hand. Her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and dawning, gut-wrenching understanding locked onto his. You did this, didn't you? Sarah confronts Ethan, her eyes burning with raw accusation, stating he knew about Kyle's heart and allowed his condition to worsen. Ethan, no longer able to maintain his lies, confesses everything to her. The affair, the record manipulation, and his cold, bitter revenge. Sarah is shattered, fully comprehending the moral decay that had festered between them. The medical board ultimately finds Ethan guilty of gross negligence and unethical conduct. His medical license is revoked, abruptly ending the career around which he had built his entire life. He faces potential legal action, but the public and professional disgrace inflict far greater damage. Ethan, stripped of his identity as a surgeon, finds himself adrift, forced to confront the broken man he has become. Sarah, despite her anger and grief, eventually develops a complicated form of forgiveness for Ethan, not for his actions, but for the broken man she once loved. Kyle, permanently altered by his heart condition, is cared for by Sarah and her family, now living a life of quiet endurance. Ethan takes on a quiet, unassuming job far removed from medicine, using it as a space for self-reflection on his past choices. He begins volunteering at a local community center, using his hands to build and mend physical objects in an attempt to rebuild himself. He finally understands the profound price of his moral compromise, the true cost of both infidelity and betrayal. The story concludes with Ethan, years later, residing on a porch in the Midwest, observing a sunset, a quiet man burdened by the heavy, unshakable weight of his past, perpetually paying the price for his actions. Sarah stood in the doorway of Ethan's apartment, the faded medical note shaking in her hand. Her eyes, usually so composed, now burned with a raw, accusing fire. "You knew about Kyle's heart," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "That congenital defect, you let this happen." The question hung in the air, a final judgment. Ethan looked at her, at the ravaged beauty of her face, and the carefully constructed edifice of his justifications crumbled. The weariness, the guilt, the bitter satisfaction, all collapsed in on themselves. He couldn't lie anymore. He confessed. The discovery of her affair, the cold, precise anger that had driven him, the deliberate burial of Kyle's records, the subtle, surgical manipulation that had left Kyle alive but irrevocably broken. Every ugly detail, every twisted turn of his revenge, spilled out into the quiet room. Sarah listened, her face growing paler with each word. When he finished, she didn't scream, didn't cry. She just looked at him, truly looked at him, and he saw the full extent of the moral rot that had festered between them. It was a silence heavier than any accusation, a deeper despair than any tears. She turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind her, a final irreparable break. The medical board found Ethan guilty. Gross negligence, unethical conduct, deliberate manipulation of patient records. The charges were damning, undeniable once the truth began to unravel. His medical license, the emblem of his identity, was revoked. Just like that, the career he had built his life around, the reason for his sacrifices, for his emotional distance, was gone. He faced potential legal action, whispers of malpractice suits, but the public and professional disgrace, the utter obliteration of his reputation, was far more damaging. Stripped of his identity as a surgeon, Ethan found himself adrift. The precision of his hands, the sharp focus of his mind, now had no outlet. He was forced to confront the man he had become, a hollow shell of ambition and bitterness. Sarah, despite her anger and grief, found a twisted form of forgiveness, not for what he did to Kyle or to her, but for the broken man she once loved, the one who had so spectacularly lost his way. She dedicated herself to Kyle's care, his life now one of quiet endurance, sustained by her steadfast, weary love and the unwavering support of Walter. Ethan left Boston, left medicine, left everything that defined him. He took a quiet, unassuming job in a small Midwestern town, far from the gleaming hospitals and the hushed reverence of surgical theaters. He worked with his hands, doing manual labor, finding a different kind of precision in carpentry, in fixing broken things. He started volunteering at a local community center, building shelves, mending furniture, using his hands not to save lives, but to simply build and repair, trying to rebuild himself in the process. Years later, Ethan Vance sat on a porch somewhere in the heartland, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A quiet man, his face lined, his gaze distant. He understood now the true price of his moral compromise, the devastating cost of infidelity and betrayal, not just for those he had hurt, but for himself. He was forever marked by the consequences of his actions, slowly, quietly paying the price, one day at a time, under the vast, indifferent Midwestern sky. Ethan Vance lived out his days far from the operating rooms, in the complex machinery of modern medicine. The Midwest offered a muted landscape, a quiet counterpoint to the sharp edges of his past. He worked with wood, with tools, fixing what was tangible, a stark contrast to the invisible architecture of a human heart. The calloused hands, once precise in saving lives, now found a different rhythm in construction, in mending fences for neighbors, in the simple act of putting things back together for others, and perhaps for himself. He rarely spoke of Boston, of Sarah, or of Kyle. The memories were not forgotten, but integrated, a deep, unhealing scar beneath the surface of his present. The cost of his choices was not paid in currency or prison time, but in the quiet, unrelenting weight of each passing day, in the constant presence of the man he had become, irrevocably changed by his own design. He learned to live with the silence, with the knowledge of what he had done and what he had forfeited. The sunset painted the fields each evening, indifferent to the private burdens beneath. He watched it, a man simply existing, carrying his entire story within him, a silent testament to the fragile line between justice and vengeance.